My own son forged my signature to steal my farm and planted evidence to send me to prison for 15 years. This is the same land his father and I built over 40 years. When the court papers arrived, it felt like the ground beneath me gave way. I could still see him as the boy who once fixed a broken fence with me, now standing on the other side, trying to erase me from my own life. Every tree holds my history, yet he saw it as a stepping stone. I thought I had lost everything, until an unexpected ally knocked on my door. The morning was crisp, the kind that carried the faint bite of autumn. From my kitchen window, I could see the orchard lawn stretching over the rolling hills, every row of trees touched with gold. I had walked these paths for decades, knew every fence post and every patch of earth that held more clay than loam. My boots crunched over the frosted grass as I made my way to the barn, where the hum of the cider press was already steady. The scent of crushed apples filled the air, sweet and sharp all at once. Keaton Orchard had been my world since my husband passed. We started with barely 40 acres, and over the years, we worked it into the 110 acres it is now. Every fence, every trellis, every grafted limb bore the mark of our labor. It had survived storms, market slumps, and lean harvests. This season looked good. The fruit was strong, the contracts were set, and the books told me we could close the year in the black. For a farmer, that is a quiet victory worth savoring. My phone sat on the counter inside the barn. It had been buzzing all morning. I tried to keep mornings for the work itself, not the noise that comes from outside these hills. But when I saw Gavin's name, I picked it up. My son's calls were never casual. His voice carried a brightness that felt practiced, like he had rehearsed the opening lines. He asked about the harvest, the equipment, even the weather. I knew there was more coming. Then it came. He spoke about Harvest Halo, his business, like it was on the edge of something big. He talked of investors, expansion, the perfect timing for growth. And then he shifted to the orchard, speaking of it like it was a number in a ledger rather than the soil that raised him. Selling, he said, could give his company the momentum it needed. He made it sound like a logical step, like it was in my interest as much as his. I stood by the press, watching the stream of cider fill the tank. I told him steady and clear that the orchard was not for sale. I had said it before, and I meant it. There was a pause. He said he understood, but his tone carried an edge, the kind that slips in when someone believes they know better. He mentioned Sloane, his wife, and how she believed this was an opportunity I would regret passing up. I could almost see her in the background, poised and sure of herself, guiding his words. After the call ended, the barn felt quieter than before. I stepped outside, letting the cold air hit my face. The orchard stretched wide before me, rows of trees standing in neat formation, the fruit catching the first light. I thought about when Gavin was younger, before ambition hardened his voice. There was a time he had stood beside me, helping mend a broken fence after a storm, laughing when the post tilted the wrong way. That boy felt far away now. As I walked the rows, I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. It was not anger yet. It was the quiet ache that comes when you realize someone you love sees what you've built, not as a legacy, but as a stepping stone. This land held our history. Every root, every stone fence, every worn path was part of a story that went deeper than profit margins. I returned to the barn and wrote down the press numbers in the ledger. The cider flowed on, steady as always, the rhythm of the work untouched by the conversation that had just unsettled me. Still, I knew what I felt that morning was not going to fade. It was the first small crack in something I had believed unshakable. If you have ever stood in the middle of what you spent your life protecting and felt it slipping towards someone else's hands, you understand. That morning was only the beginning, though I didn't want to admit it. Some storms don't arrive with thunder. They start with a single conversation, quiet but sharp enough to cut through the calm. And when they do, you either brace yourself or get swept away. I knew I had to be ready. Gavin pulled in just after lunch with Sloane in the passenger seat, both of them dressed as if a camera might be waiting at the end of the driveway. He carried a slim laptop case and a folder with colour tabs. She carried a bakery box and a smile that looked perfectly measured. I met them on the porch and led them to the big table by the kitchen window, where the light was clean and the view of the lower rows stretched all the way to the creek. They did not ask for a tour. Gavin said he wanted to show me Harvest Halo. He set the laptop down and opened a deck filled with neat blue charts and soft green icons. The first slide named a problem. Small farms struggled with market access. Shoppers wanted traceable food. Distribution costs ate the margins. He tapped through slides at a practiced pace. A grid of city neighborhoods. An arrowed map of cold chain routes. A timeline stacked in weeks, not seasons. I could tell he had done this talk more than once. Sloane placed the bakery box near my elbow and said she admired the orchard more than any she had seen, that the story of a widow building a 110-acre operation was the kind of authenticity people were hungry for. Her voice had a gentle warmth. While she spoke, she and Gavin traded quick looks, as if checking off beats they had rehearsed. Her praise was not careless. It landed in places where pride and fatigue lived together. Gavin moved to the money slide. Comparable land sales in the county, conservative and stretch valuations, a column that translated acres into launch capital. He said a sale or structured transfer could fund a small warehouse lease, a fleet of refrigerated vans, and the software build. He framed it as a partnership that would lift everyone. The word family sat in the air like a signpost. Another slide showed a mock brand rollout. Sloane described short films that would follow a bottle from blossom to doorstep. She pointed to a header that used our last name in a serif font and a soft cream background, then to a photo of my hands lifting a crate. She said my presence gave the brand its moral center. She said I would not need to work the long days anymore. I could speak at openings, cut ribbons, host a seasonal tasting. She made it sound like rest dressed up as honor. I asked how operations here would change, and Sloane glided to a page titled Transition. The cider house could be repurposed into a flagship vendor space. The tanks might stay as visual storytelling. The back acreage could host a compact processing hub, while the front rows remained as a photogenic buffer. Gavin added that permitting windows were opening in the spring, so momentum now mattered. They moved with precision. When Sloane sensed I was weighing the words, she softened the room with a memory of her grandmother saving a diner by pivoting to breakfast service. When Gavin felt the energy dip, he nudged the numbers forward. He did not say, sell outright. He said, unlock value. He did not say, mortgage. He said, strategic leverage. Every phrase had been scrubbed until the edges rounded off. I kept notes on a small pad and watched the orchard through the window. A hawk turned above the lower pasture. The bare branches caught the light along the ridge. This land had never fit into the language of decks. It spoke in seasons and in work done at the right hour. Still, I listened. I wanted to hear if there was anything beneath the polish that understood what it costs to keep a place alive through the dull years. Gavin brought up an example list of routes: 3 neighborhoods uptown, 2 in Brooklyn, drop windows arranged to beat traffic and tolls. He said demand was surging for honest food. If we hesitated, competitors would move. He angled the laptop so I had to lean closer. The line on his jaw flexed when he said momentum. Sloane slid the folder toward me. Inside were one-pagers with tidy headers: brand story, launch calendar, influencer partnerships, a page titled Founder Legacy, with a schedule of appearances and suggested talking points. I looked at the bullet lines that reduced a life to 3 clean sentences. She told me my voice could travel farther this way, that I had earned the right to step back from mud and frost and early alarms. Through it all, I noticed small things. The way Gavin's fingers tapped a silent rhythm when I paused too long. The way Sloane's eyes cooled for a beat whenever I looked away from the screen. The smell of the bakery box drifting up, lemon and sugar, like a staged comfort. Nothing in their pitch was sloppy. Nothing was spontaneous. When the last slide faded, they let the room rest. Gavin said I could think on it. Permitting would come fast. Investors were eager. Sloane said their door was open. She touched my forearm lightly, just long enough to read my reaction, then pulled back with a soft nod. I closed the folder and set it square on the table. I thanked them for the work. I told Gavin the orchard was not a reserve to be tapped. We would need to be clear on that. He held my gaze, and behind the brightness I saw a flick of surprise, the kind that flashes before the next move. Sloane smiled and gathered the one-pagers as if nothing in the room had moved at all. They left with the bakery box opened and a half slice on a plate. The kitchen settled into its usual sounds: the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the old wall clock. Outside, the light shifted across the lower rows, steady as breath. The pitch hung in the air like perfume that takes a long time to fade. I washed the plate, dried it, and slid it back into its place. The day had been neat on the surface. Underneath, I felt the ground begin to change. The next morning, I found Gavin's folder still on the corner of the kitchen table. The papers were perfectly aligned, just as Sloane had left them. I slid them into a drawer without opening them again. There was no point in reading what I had already decided to refuse. The orchard was not a number in a column. It was the ground under my feet, the trees I had pruned with my own hands, the smell of cider on cold mornings. Selling it, even dressed in polite language, was still losing it. By mid-afternoon, Gavin came back, this time without Sloane. He parked close to the porch and walked up with the easy stride he used when he wanted to look unbothered. He carried 2 coffees and a paper bag, like it was just a casual visit. I met him at the door and let him in. We sat at the table where the light fell in a wide square on the wood. He asked about the harvest again, the way you do when you are circling something harder. I told him it was steady, then I said it plain, before he could warm up his pitch again. I was not interested in Harvest Halo or any sale. This land was staying as it was. The words felt clean as I said them, but the air between us shifted. Gavin nodded slowly like he was listening, but his fingers curled tighter around the coffee cup. His mouth kept a small curve that did not reach his eyes. He said he understood. His tone was smooth, but I caught the brief tightening along his jaw, the quick blink that came too fast. I had seen that look before, back when he was a boy, losing a game he thought he could win. He held his smile a moment longer before looking down at the table. He mentioned how the market was changing, how I might not always be able to keep up. He said it lightly, but the weight in his voice sat heavy. Then he added that Sloane thought this might be the kind of opportunity people my age did not always recognize until it had passed. The words landed like a stone in water, sending out slow ripples. I did not reply to that. There are things you do not dignify with a response. When he stood to leave, the smile was back in place. He said he would give me space to think. I walked him to the porch. He stepped down and paused, looking out toward the fence line. A section of the old wooden rail had split near the gate, leaning out at an odd angle. It had happened in the last storm. I had meant to fix it, but the work inside had pulled me away. Gavin glanced at it, then at me, a faint lift of one eyebrow. He did not say anything, but the meaning was there. Cracks left alone only spread. After he drove off, I walked to the fence. The wood was damp and soft where the break had been. I pressed my palm to it and felt the give. Out past the fence, the orchard stretched toward the ridge, the trees bare now but holding the shape of next season's work. I thought about how families can be like these boards, joined strong for years until weather and neglect find a way in. The house was quiet when I came back in. The drawer with the folder sat closed. I did not touch it. I made tea, sat in the old chair by the window, and watched the light change over the lower rows. Gavin's words stayed with me, not for their sharpness, but for what they revealed. He was not just making a business offer. He was measuring me, testing where the weak points were. I could feel the distance between us widening, even as we spoke in the same room. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the loose section of fence. The sound was small, but it carried. I knew then that this was more than one conversation. It was the start of a slow, deliberate push. And I understood that the first real crack had already formed, not in the fence, but here, between us. By the following week, the orchard had settled back into its rhythm, but I knew better than to believe calm would last. On Thursday morning, Gavin's truck pulled into the gravel drive, and this time Sloane stepped out with him. She wore a deep green coat, the kind that made her stand out against the muted colours of the season, and carried a leather folio tucked under her arm. Gavin followed a step behind, his hands in his jacket pockets, his smile deliberate. They came into the kitchen without waiting for me to invite them, setting their things on the table as if it were already theirs. Sloane began pulling glossy mock-ups and printed pages from the folio, laying them out in a neat fan. She talked as she worked, her voice smooth, measured, as if she were telling me a story instead of pitching a deal. She described Harvest Halo as a movement, not just a business. There were photographs of tasting rooms with brushed steel accents, shelves lined with uniform bottles, and groups of young professionals holding cider glasses high under strings of lights. I stayed standing by the counter, arms folded. Gavin leaned forward over the table, pointing to one of the images. He said this was what the orchard could be, a brand people would travel for. Sloane glanced at him briefly, her eyes sharp but her smile unwavering. She told me that in markets like New York and Boston, the story of a family orchard reinventing itself could drive demand for years. She made it sound like inevitability, not possibility. Then Gavin cut in, his voice lighter than his words. He said the truth was that I was letting the property sleep. He told me the land had more potential than I was willing to see. I could hear the faint scrape of his wedding ring against the tabletop as he tapped one of the charts for emphasis. I had heard that tone before, the one that slid from persuasion into quiet reproach. I told them the same thing I had told Gavin on the phone, and again in person. The orchard was not for sale, and it was not up for reinvention. I reminded them that every tree, every barrel, every inch of fence had been maintained by hand, and that its value was not just in what it could earn. Sloane nodded politely as though she understood, but her fingers gathered the papers slowly, her gaze drifting to the window as if already thinking ahead to the next move. Gavin's smile stayed in place, but the lines around his mouth tightened. He said he respected my decision, but there was a weight to the way he spoke, a suggestion that this conversation was far from over. As they packed up, Sloane tucked one page back into the folio more carefully than the rest. I caught a glimpse of it before it disappeared. A map of the orchard marked with coloured zones, numbers printed along the edges. It was not the kind of document you make for a first meeting. They left without a handshake, just the faint scent of Sloane's perfume lingering in the air. I watched from the window as they walked to the truck. Gavin opened the driver's door, but Sloane paused, her hand resting briefly on his arm. Whatever she said, it made him glance back toward the house before getting in. When the sound of their engine faded, I sat at the table and stared at the space where the papers had been. The images were gone, but the impression they left remained. They had come with more than a proposal this time. They had come with a vision that had no room for the life I had built here. I went outside, walking the path toward the northern edge of the property. The wind was colder than it had been the week before, carrying the scent of damp earth. I reached the old section of fence where the boards leaned, one post cracked at the base. It had been like that for a while, but today it looked different. Less like a minor repair waiting for my attention, more like a sign of something shifting. I touched the wood, feeling the grain rough beneath my palm. A fence is meant to keep what is inside safe and what is outside at bay. But a weak point, even a small one, can invite a breach. As I turned back toward the house, I felt the weight of that thought settle in. The orchard had always been my shield, my anchor. Now it felt like someone was looking for the exact spot where it could be undone. The first snow of the season came early that year, just a thin layer dusting the orchard, but enough to make the branches bow and the paths crunch underfoot. I was stacking wood by the back porch when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Gavin's SUV rolled to a stop, the engine cutting off but the heat still ghosting from under the hood. He stepped out alone this time, no Sloane at his side, and for a brief second I thought maybe this was a truce. He came up the steps with a paper coffee cup in one hand, his smile too quick to be easy. Inside, he sat at the kitchen table without asking, looking around as if measuring the place. We talked about the weather for all of 30 seconds before he shifted the conversation, his words sliding back to the orchard. He didn't bother with pictures or charts this time. Instead, he leaned in and told me plainly that holding on to the property as it was made no sense. He talked about market downturns, rising costs, and how age made certain decisions harder, not easier. The words stung, not because I hadn't heard them before, but because they came from him. I told him my mind was unchanged. The orchard wasn't a dormant asset to be unlocked. It was my life's work. Gavin didn't argue right away. He just looked at me with a faint tilt of his head, as if he were studying something he couldn't quite recognize anymore. Then he said, almost lightly, that people lose perspective when they've been in one place too long, that sometimes it takes someone younger to see what is really possible. For a moment, the room felt smaller. I remembered the day his father died, how Gavin had stood in this same kitchen, shoulders tight, trying not to cry. I had promised him then that I would keep the orchard strong, that he would always have a place here if he needed it. That memory brushed against the edge of this moment, and the contrast made my chest ache. I told him he was free to build whatever future he wanted, but not on the ground his father and I had kept for decades. The shift in his face was subtle but sharp. His mouth held the shape of a smile, but the warmth in his eyes went flat. He leaned back in his chair and said he understood. Then he added that there were other ways to get where he needed to go, ways that didn't depend on my agreement. The way he said it was quiet, but it stayed in the air after he left. I stood at the window, watching him walk to his car, the snow crunching under his boots. He didn't look back. That night, I walked the orchard paths until the cold pushed through my coat. The moonlight turned the snow to silver, and the trees stood in perfect lines, their bare branches a black lace against the sky. I thought about how fragile ownership can be when someone close decides it is just an obstacle. You imagine the threats will come from outside, from storms or markets or strangers. You don't think they will come from the person you once carried in your arms. By the time I reached the northern fence, the wind had picked up, sharp enough to sting. The broken post was still leaning, a shadow in the white. I made a note in my head to fix it before the next storm, though I knew now that not all breaches can be mended with new wood and nails. Some require a different kind of defense, one that isn't about keeping things out, but about holding your ground when someone is already inside. I went back to the house, stoked the fire, and sat at the table where Gavin had been that afternoon. The faint ring from his coffee cup was still on the wood. I traced it with my fingertip, thinking how something small can mark the surface without sinking in deep. Then I thought of his words, the tone beneath them, and I knew the mark he intended to leave was not going to fade. The envelope was thick, the kind that never carries good news. It came in the late afternoon, delivered by a young postal worker whose eyes darted away when I opened the door. He handed it over without a word, but his glance toward the ground told me enough. I stood in the doorway for a moment after he left, the cold air creeping into the hall as I stared at my name in sharp black print. Inside, the papers smelled faintly of ink and something chemical, like they had been rushed off a copy machine. The first page carried the seal of the county court. My name was listed as the defendant in a civil complaint, the charges laid out in rigid legal language. There were accusations of environmental violations, claims that my orchard was contaminating a nearby water source. Attached were copies of alleged loan agreements with my signature, only I knew I had never signed them. I sat at the kitchen table, my hand tightening around each page as I read. The supposed loans were dated months ago, the amounts far beyond anything I would ever borrow. The signature was mine in shape, but not in truth. I had signed my name thousands of times in my life, and I knew exactly where the ink should flow, where the pen naturally lifted. This was a forgery, clean enough to fool someone who didn't know me, messy enough to make my stomach turn. The environmental claims came next. There were photographs of rusted drums half buried near the edge of the property, the kind of images that speak louder than any denial. I knew those drums weren't mine. I knew every corner of this land, and nothing like that had been there last week. It was the kind of setup you only see when someone wants you out completely, not just pressured into selling. The weight of it pressed down on my chest. Accusations like these didn't just threaten the orchard. They threatened me personally. Fines could be crushing, but the bigger fear was the whisper of criminal charges buried in the language. 15 years in prison. That was the maximum penalty mentioned in one section. The thought of it sat in my mind like ice. I read the documents again, this time slower, forcing myself to look for patterns. The loans were supposedly issued by a lending company I didn't recognize. The signature of the notary was one I had never seen before. The complaint named the company as a co-plaintiff, alongside an environmental watchdog group I had never had contact with. It felt orchestrated, too clean to be coincidence. By the time I finished, the light outside had faded into the dim grey of early evening. The fire in the stove had burned low, but I didn't get up to tend it. My thoughts kept circling back to the same place. This was not a random attack. Someone had laid groundwork, step by step, knowing exactly where to hit. And I couldn't ignore the timing. It came on the heels of my last conversation with Gavin, his thinly veiled warning about other ways to move forward. I placed the papers in a neat stack and set them at the center of the table. For a long moment, I just sat there, letting the silence settle. It wasn't fear that filled me then. It was something heavier, something slower, a deep awareness that I had crossed from uneasy disagreements into open conflict. When I finally rose, I moved through the house checking the locks, not because I thought someone was coming tonight, but because it steadied me to secure what I could. In the mudroom, my boots waited by the door. I pulled them on and stepped outside. The cold bit at my cheeks as I walked toward the edge of the property, toward the place where the photographs claimed the barrels sat. The moon was low, casting pale light across the snow. At the northern fence line, I saw the ground disturbed. The soil churned as if something had been dragged and half buried. And there they were, two metal drums, their sides mottled with rust. The sight made my throat tighten. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted to frame me, they wanted to make it stick. I stood there for a long time, my breath hanging in the air. The orchard lay quiet behind me, the trees stretching in patient rows. In that stillness, a thought rooted itself. I was no longer just defending a business or a piece of land. I was defending my name, my life, and the years of work that no one could give back. When I turned toward the house, the cold felt sharper, but so did my resolve. Whatever was coming, I would not meet it with my hands open in surrender. The knock came just after noon, sharp and deliberate. I had been in the kitchen, the court papers still spread out on the table from the night before. When I opened the door, Gavin stood there with Sloane beside him, both holding paper bags that smelled faintly of roast chicken and bread. They wore the same expressions I had seen on them at holidays, polite, a little too careful, as if bracing for a reaction. Gavin stepped inside without waiting, setting the bags down on the counter like it was his kitchen. Sloane followed, placing a glass dish covered in foil on the stove. She made small remarks about how tired I must be, how the weather had turned colder than expected. It was a performance, the kind you rehearse when you need the other person to feel like you are here to help. I stayed by the doorway, watching them move around my space. Gavin reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim manila envelope. He slid it across the table toward me, his eyes steady. He said it was just something to help keep things simple while the legal matters were sorted out. His voice was calm, but the way his hand lingered on the edge of the envelope made it clear he expected me to open it right then. Inside was a single-page document, printed on crisp letterhead. The language was legal and clean, an authorization for him to act as my representative in all pending matters regarding the orchard, a power of attorney. His name sat in the line where mine should have been, waiting only for my signature. Sloane spoke before I could respond. She told me that these legal issues could drag on for months, maybe years, and that this would allow Gavin to make fast decisions, avoid delays, and keep the orchard from falling into more trouble. Her tone was warm, almost gentle, but her eyes stayed fixed on me like she was measuring every breath I took. I didn't touch the pen Gavin had set next to the paper. My hands stayed in my lap as I asked what would happen if I didn't sign. Gavin's mouth curved, not into a smile but something close, an expression meant to look harmless but carrying an edge I knew well. He said it would just mean more stress for me, more time wasted, and less chance of a good outcome. The smell of the roast chicken filled the kitchen, rich and heavy. It made the moment feel almost surreal, like we were sitting down to Sunday dinner while an entirely different conversation ran underneath. I thought of the years Gavin had lived here after college, working the orchard with me during harvests, calling it our land when he spoke to friends. I remembered the time he had run up a debt so large I had taken out a second mortgage to help him clear it. I had trusted him then, and I had never once asked for repayment. That trust had been given freely, but now I saw how easily it could be used as leverage. Sloane leaned forward, her manicured hand resting lightly on the paper, as if to guide my eyes back to it. She said she and Gavin had been talking to people who could resolve the environmental accusations quickly, but only if the orchard's ownership and management were made clear in the records. She let the implication hang between us. I sat still, my gaze moving from the paper to their faces. I could feel the shape of the moment, the quiet trap, dressed in the language of help. Signing would give them control, not just over the orchard, but over every decision tied to it. I pushed the document back toward Gavin, slow enough that it could not be mistaken for anything but refusal. His fingers tightened slightly as he took it. The brightness in his expression faded, leaving his face blank, but I caught the flicker of something sharp in his eyes. Sloane gathered the bags and the dish, saying they would leave the food for me. Her voice stayed smooth, but her movements were quicker now, less measured. Gavin said nothing else as they headed to the door. From the window above the sink, I watched them walk down the path toward their car. Just before they reached it, Sloane turned toward Gavin. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her shoulders stiffen, her hand cutting through the air as she spoke. Gavin's reply was short, and then he opened the car door without looking at her. I stood there until the sound of the engine faded down the road. The kitchen felt colder, the smell of chicken no longer inviting but clinging, like the memory of a conversation you cannot shake. I gathered the untouched bags and placed them in the fridge, not because I wanted them, but because I could not yet bring myself to throw them out. The envelope, now empty, lay on the table. I folded it in half and set it aside, a reminder of how close they were willing to stand to take what was mine. I woke the next morning to a sky the color of tin, the kind that makes you pull your sweater tighter before you even step outside. The night had been restless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that manila envelope sliding across the table, Sloane's hand hovering like a shadow over mine. It had been more than an offer. It was a warning, and I knew it. I walked the length of the orchard just after sunrise. The frost still clung to the edges of the grass, and the air smelled faintly of apples that had fallen and begun to soften on the ground. I found myself looking at the property in pieces, the fence lines, the old barn, the irrigation pumps, wondering what each was worth to someone who didn't care about the history here. It made me feel both protective and unsettled, as though I were standing watch over something under siege. By mid-morning, I saw their SUV pull up at the end of the drive. This time, they didn't bother with the bags of food or polite pretense. Gavin stepped out first, his stride clipped, his face unreadable. Sloane followed, her coat pulled tight, her gaze sweeping the property before settling on me. They didn't ask to come in. We stood on the porch, the cold air sharpening the distance between us. Gavin spoke first, saying they understood I needed time to think. His voice was even, but the way he shifted his weight told me he was holding something back. Sloane nodded along, though her eyes kept moving, scanning for something she could use. I told them there was nothing to think about. My answer was the same as it had been from the start. Gavin's jaw tightened, but he smiled like we were just having a difference of opinion over something small. Then he asked if I realized how bad the situation could get. I could see the tension in the line of his neck, the way he swallowed before speaking again. Sloane stayed quiet until Gavin turned to go. Then she stepped forward, her voice low and smooth, reminding me how much she and Gavin had invested in this new venture. She said it would be a shame if I let the orchard become the reason they lost everything. The way she said it that carried more weight than the words themselves. They started down the path toward the car, and I thought that was the end of it. But halfway there, Gavin stopped. He said something to Sloane, and she spun toward him, her face tightening. I couldn't make out the words, but her hands moved sharply, cutting through the air like punctuation. He shook his head once, then kept walking. From where I stood, I could see the space between them widen as they reached the car. Sloane hesitated before getting in, standing for a moment like she was deciding whether to follow him or turn back toward me. In the end, she slid into the passenger seat without another glance. When they drove away, I stayed on the porch, trying to piece together what I had just seen. It wasn't the united front they had shown before. There were cracks, faint but there, and I knew enough about pressure to know that cracks have a way of spreading. I went back inside and sat at the table. The empty envelope from the day before was still there, folded in half. I turned it over in my hands, thinking about the look on Gavin's face when I pushed it back toward him. It wasn't just frustration, it was calculation, the kind of look that meant he was already working on the next move. The rest of the day passed in fits and starts. I tried to lose myself in work, but every sound, the phone ringing, a car passing on the road, set me on edge. The orchard had always been a place of steadiness, of predictable rhythms. Now it felt like I was standing on ground that could shift under me without warning. That night, as I locked up, I caught sight of my reflection in the kitchen window. I looked tired, but there was something else too, a firmness in my expression I hadn't seen in a while. They could circle me, press me, try to push me into a corner. But as long as I had my footing, I wasn't going to give them what they wanted. The frost would be heavier by morning. I would walk the orchard again, make my rounds, and keep the routines that had carried me this far. But now, I was watching more closely. The cracks between them were real, and if I was patient, I might just be able to use them. It was late afternoon when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. For a moment, my chest tightened, expecting the familiar black SUV, but instead, a dusty blue sedan came into view. The door opened, and out stepped Maggie Harper. She looked almost the same as she had the last time I saw her, shoulders squared, a streak of silver in her hair, and that deliberate way of walking like she was always arriving with a plan. We had known each other since before my marriage. Maggie had gone on to work for a respected law firm in town, and though our paths had drifted over the years, there had never been any bad blood. I had called her that morning after waking with the uneasy sense that I was running out of time and allies. She hadn't asked for details over the phone, only said she would stop by after work. She stepped into the kitchen and set her leather bag on the table. No small talk. She reached inside, pulled out a notepad, and said she needed to hear everything from the beginning. Dates, names, copies of whatever I had. I told her about the sudden push from Gavin and Sloane, the papers they brought, the strange hints about financial trouble, and then the letter from the court about a loan I had never taken. When I slid the envelope toward her, she adjusted her glasses and began reading, her pen moving quickly across the page. She asked how Gavin might have gotten access to my personal documents. I told her about the times he had stayed here while I was away at produce fairs or visiting friends, and the way he had always known where I kept things. Maggie didn't look surprised. She asked for any other paperwork connected to the orchard, title deeds, tax records, even the environmental inspection reports I kept filed in the pantry cabinet. I fetched the boxes, setting them down with a dull thud on the kitchen floor. She began sifting through them, organizing everything into neat piles. Halfway through, she found something that made her pause. It was a duplicate loan application, unsigned, but filled in with my information, right down to the property boundaries. The lender's name was one Maggie recognized. She explained that this was a company known for partnering with developers to acquire agricultural land under the pretense of environmental violations. That was when she asked about the supposed pollution charges mentioned in the court letter. I led her outside to the back of the property, to the creek that ran behind the north field. A month ago, I had found an old chemical drum lying near the bank. At the time, I assumed it had drifted from somewhere upstream after the heavy rains. But Maggie crouched beside it, pointing to the faint lettering and the code number stamped into the metal. She said these drums were often used in commercial orchards, but this brand had been discontinued years ago. Her suspicion was clear. The drum had been planted there, not washed in by chance. We walked back toward the house as the sun dipped behind the hills, the cold settling heavier in the air. Inside, Maggie spread the documents across the table in a pattern that made sense only to her. She said there was enough here to suggest that Gavin and Sloane were working with the lender, possibly in exchange for shares in whatever development would follow once the orchard was forced into sale. The thought settled like lead in my chest. It wasn't just ambition driving them. It was a deliberate scheme to strip me of what I had built. Maggie closed her notepad and told me we would need to move carefully. She would take copies of everything tonight, bring them to a contact she trusted at the county records office, and start cross-referencing signatures. If they had forged my name on anything official, it would show. Before she left, she paused in the doorway, studying me for a long moment. She reminded me that this was not the first time a family had tried to edge an elder out of land that held more value than they realized. But she said it with a steadiness that felt less like pity and more like resolve. When her car disappeared down the drive, I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, looking at the cleared space where the piles of papers had been. The air felt different now, less heavy, though the danger was still there. I had someone in my corner again, someone who understood the rules of this kind of fight. For the first time in weeks, I felt the smallest shift inside me, as though a door I thought was locked had cracked open just enough to let the light in. 2 days later, Maggie returned with a folder so thick it barely fit into her bag. She didn't bother sitting down before pulling out the first set of documents. Photocopies of email chains, some between Gavin and the lender, others between Sloane and an environmental consultant whose name neither of us recognized. The dates lined up exactly with the sudden appearance of that chemical drum by the creek. One email caught my eye immediately. Sloane had written about accelerating the case for violation and mentioned that the lender was prepared to move as soon as the property owner signs off or is removed through legal process. Her words were clinical, but the intent was unmistakable. Maggie explained that her contact at the county records office had also found a forged authorization form in the lender's archive. The signature was a poor imitation of mine, but close enough to pass unless someone looked closely. That document gave the lender permission to conduct soil testing without my consent. The results from those tests were then used to claim the orchard posed a contamination risk. I sat back, the weight of it settling in. This wasn't just greed anymore. It was a calculated dismantling of my life's work. Maggie wasn't finished. She handed me a printed photo, grainy, but clear enough to recognize Sloane's profile. She was standing beside the creek, phone to her ear, while a man unloaded something from the back of a pickup truck. In the bed of the truck were 2 more drums, identical to the one we had found. The next set of papers were bank records, showing transfers from a business account linked to Gavin into a holding company that the lender used for payouts. The amounts matched the timeline of each legal step taken against me. Maggie believed these payments were kickbacks, a way to ensure Gavin and Sloane profited regardless of the orchard's fate. She laid everything out on the table in a precise order, almost like a map. Emails, financial records, photos, and the forged signature. It was a trail, one that led straight back to them. We spent the next few hours piecing together the sequence. Maggie dictated notes while I filled in details she couldn't know. Days when Gavin had stopped by unexpectedly, strange phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize, or times I had noticed Sloane taking photos around the property without explanation. When she was satisfied, Maggie said the evidence was strong enough to present to both the county prosecutor and the state's agricultural commission. But she also warned me that once this moved forward, Gavin and Sloane would know they had been exposed. They might try to spin the story, or worse, escalate their pressure on me. I thought about the way Gavin had looked at me during our last meeting, polite on the surface, but with something sharper underneath. I knew there would be no coming back from this, no return to a civil relationship. That realization sat heavy, but it didn't make me hesitate. The next morning we drove into town. Maggie carried the folder into the prosecutor's office herself. I waited in the hallway, the smell of coffee and old carpet settling around me while she met with him. When she returned, her expression was steady. He had taken the file, promised to review it immediately, and said he would be in touch within the week. From there, we went to the office of a local reporter Maggie trusted. She explained that public exposure could keep the process honest, make it harder for anyone to quietly make the case disappear. The reporter listened carefully, flipping through the pages, asking only for clarification on a few points. She said she would start digging into the lender's past deals and the consultant's record. By the time we drove back to the orchard, the winter light was fading, the hills deepening into shadow. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose boards on the old shed. I stood on the porch as Maggie's car pulled away, the sound of the engine fading down the road. Inside, I gathered the ledgers and farm records, stacking them neatly on the desk in my office. It struck me that this was the first time in weeks I felt some measure of control, not certainty. There was still a long road ahead, but control. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was moving forward, step by deliberate step. That night, as I locked the front door, I glanced toward the orchard. Even in the dark, the shapes of the trees were familiar, grounding. They had weathered storms before. Now it was my turn to do the same. 3 days after we left the prosecutor's office, the first ripple hit. A local news station aired a segment about environmental sabotage tied to predatory land acquisition. They didn't name me, but the aerial shots of the orchard left little doubt. By the end of the broadcast, my phone was lit with calls I had no intention of answering. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp burning, the stack of documents Maggie had left for me spread out in neat rows. Every page felt heavier than paper should, as if the weight of truth could be measured. The prosecutor had confirmed the case was moving forward. The Agricultural Commission had also opened its own inquiry. There was no stopping the tide now. 2 mornings later, the phone rang again, this time from an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened, Gavin's voice filled the room. It started calm, measured, then shifted into something sharper. He said he knew what I had done, that I had turned on him, that this would not end well for either of us. He mentioned the word family in a way that didn't sound like a bond, but a threat. By afternoon, the calls multiplied. Sloane left one too, her tone icy. She accused me of humiliating them, of ruining years of work, of dragging private matters into public view. I recognized the edge in her voice. It was the sound of someone whose careful control had slipped. That evening, Maggie came by. She had been contacted by the prosecutor's office. Gavin had been served with a summons, and so had Sloane. The charges included fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit environmental violations. Maggie warned me that the coming weeks would be noisy, statements to the press, lawyers trying to twist the story, and plenty of attempts to paint me as unreasonable. I nodded, already knowing this fight had moved beyond the orchard. It wasn't just about land anymore, it was about making sure the truth stayed visible, no matter how hard they tried to bury it. 2 days later, the local paper ran a front-page story. This time, my name was there. They outlined the case, printed excerpts from the emails, and showed one of the photographs Maggie had found. the one with Sloane by the truck at the creek. The reaction was immediate. Neighbors stopped by, some with quiet words of support, others with cautious curiosity. Late in the afternoon, as I was closing up the cider house, a black sedan pulled into the drive. Gavin stepped out, dressed sharply, but his face carried a tightness I hadn't seen before. He walked toward me slowly as if weighing each step. When he spoke, his voice was low, deliberate. He said he never wanted it to come to this, that I could still fix things if I stopped pushing. He hinted that the charges could disappear if I signed over controlling interest in the orchard. His eyes didn't match his words. They were restless, calculating. I told him it was too late. Not in anger, but in the same steady tone I used when pruning a tree past saving. His jaw tightened. He looked past me, toward the orchard, then back again. Without another word, he turned and left, the car's tires crunching over the gravel until the sound faded completely. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat by the window, watching the bare branches shift in the wind. It struck me how easily the lines between love, loyalty, and ownership can blur, how quickly they can be rewritten when greed takes root. The next morning, Maggie called with news. The prosecutor had filed a motion to freeze the holding company accounts linked to Gavin and Sloane. It was a decisive move, one that meant their ability to maneuver was shrinking by the hour. I went out to the orchard after that. The air was cold, the ground firm under my boots. The fence along the northern edge still needed mending, but I stood there for a long time before turning back. This land had carried me through more than one storm. Now it was carrying me through this one too. Inside the cider house, the press was quiet, waiting for the next run. I placed my hands on the worn wood of the counter, letting the stillness settle. For the first time in months, I felt that the ground under me was beginning to steady, not because the fight was over, it wasn't, but because I had chosen to stand firm, and I wasn't standing alone anymore. The first real sign of calm came on a Tuesday morning when Maggie called to tell me the state had dropped every charge against me. The Environmental Commission's report was clear: no violations, no negligence, and strong evidence that the accusations had been fabricated. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in my hands, reading it twice before letting the weight of it sink in. The fight had taken months, but my name was finally cleared. That same week, word spread through town that Gavin and Sloane were facing their own legal storm. Fraud, forgery, and conspiracy charges had been formally filed. The accounts tied to their holding company were frozen, and a court date was set. I did not feel triumphant. The truth had surfaced, but it carried no joy in seeing my own son in this position. Some damage cannot be undone. Still, the orchard was mine again, without question. I walked the rows that afternoon, boots sinking slightly into the thawing ground. The winter light lay soft across the bare branches. There was quiet in the air, not the uneasy kind, but the kind that comes when something heavy has finally been set down. The northern fence had been repaired a few days earlier. Maggie had shown up with tools and insisted on helping. We worked side by side without much talking, but when we finished, we stood back and looked at the straight, sturdy line. It felt like more than just wood and wire. It was a boundary made solid again. Over the next week, I turned my attention to the future. I met with the local conservation board and began the process of placing the orchard under a protective trust. The land would stay intact for as long as it stood, safe from developers and speculators. At the same time, I started drafting plans for a water preservation fund for the valley, using a portion of the orchard's seasonal profits. Maggie agreed to serve as one of the trustees. It was not about erasing what had happened. The betrayal was still a part of my story. and so was the loss of trust. But I would not let it be the final word. This land had been built from years of labour and care, and now it would stand for something larger than my own lifetime. One afternoon, I stood with Maggie on the porch, mugs of cider warming our hands. From there, the view stretched over the orchard and down to the creek. The repaired fence caught the last of the sunlight. Maggie smiled slightly and said it looked like the place was breathing again. I told her maybe we both were. In the quiet that followed, I thought about how much had shifted since that first phone call from Gavin. Back then, it had felt like the ground was slipping under me. Now it felt steady, not because everything was perfect, but because I had refused to give away what mattered most. As winter moved toward spring, the orchard would wake again. The buds would form, the rose would green, and the press in the cider house would hum back to life. And I would be here, watching it all, knowing the fight had been worth it. This story is not just about land or legal battles. It is about holding on to what defines you, even when the people you love try to take it away. Standing firm does not always mean standing alone. Sometimes it means finding the right hands to help you hold the line. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to protect something that was more than just property, something that was a part of who you are? If this story speaks to that place in you, share it so others can remember that strength can be quiet, but it lasts.